The C-SPAN networks bring you long-form public affairs programming from the nation's capital and are a public service of your television provider. C-SPAN, created by cable.
Well, with the announcement this week that the Washington Post has been sold to Jeff Bezos, we thought we'd take this opportunity on the Communicators to look at changes in the newspaper industry and the potential future of the news industry in general. We have two guests joining us this week. First, we want to introduce you to Alan Mutter. He is in San Francisco and he is a newspaper consultant. He's a lecturer as well at the University of California, Berkeley on media economics. And he has served as a newspaper editor, a cable TV executive, and a tech CEO. Today he consults with both traditional and traditional and digital companies. Also joining us from our New York studio is Edmund Lee, who is the media reporter for Bloomberg News. And Mr. Lee, if we could start with you, how big a deal is this sale?
Well, it's a big deal in secular terms, at least. In terms of numbers, in terms of finances, $250 million it's a lot of money, certainly, but compared to a lot of other media deals that have been out there, it's pretty small. It's more the fact that it's the Washington Post, a storied brand, a storied newspaper that, once helped topple a sitting U.S. president, and Jeff Bezos, who on the other side of the country, who's a well-known internet billionaire, despite the fact that he tends to be fairly press shy, ironically enough. So that's the size of this deal. It's the secular interest, the big names behind it.
Is there interest in this deal, Mr. Lee, outside of Washington and outside of media circles?
You know what? I think the fact that there are probably almost everyone in this country at some point has come across Amazon, either bought something or at least is aware of it, will at least get Main Street's attention. But yes, the focus is the power centers, media, Washington, D.C., of course, and Silicon Valley. So these are pretty important areas to get people's attention. In that way, it'll just sort of amplify. It'll amplify down across the country and into Main Street. Also, what it means for newspapers in general. You have sort of the old media, new media linking up here. And I think that's what's drawing a lot of the attention and a lot of speculation as to what will happen to the Post and what will happen to newspapers in general. And it seems like Mr. Bezos, he clearly has something in mind. We still don't know what it is, though.
Alan Mutter, same question. How big a deal is this deal?
Well, to a lot of people, it's not a big deal at all, but it's certainly a big deal in the journalism community. People are going to wonder about how this new owner will guide the journalistic side of the enterprise, but also inside of the media business. This is a huge story because it's the first time that a true digital native has stepped into one of the legacy media businesses, a newspaper or a broadcasting company. And if he acts in any way like he did in disrupting the book publishing business, the book selling business, the delivery of streaming media, and certainly e-commerce, then Mr. Bezos probably will disrupt and re-envision what it is to be a newspaper in the 21st century and how that business remains a business.
What kind of disruptions could you foresee?
Well, as I said, he's very much one of the authors, if you will, of the modern digital world. And he understands the technology, and he understands enormously the modern consumer, both of books and things as mundane as diapers or pens. So I think he will bring together those two threads, his understanding of the consumer and his understanding of digital information delivery and digital commerce. He'll bring those things together and say, okay, here's a major national/international brand. It's got enormous rich content. It's got a big audience already, but could we make the audience bigger? Could we do more things with the content? Are there more ways to extract money from this large audience? And of course, can we make the audience bigger and make even more money?
And a question for both of you, and we'll start with you, Mr. Mutter. How do you personalize the newspaper business like you do Amazon?
Well, a broadcast on radio or TV or a printed publication like a newspaper or magazine is a one-size-fits-all product. It may have lots of different points of entry. It may have different programs to watch from hour to hour on TV. There are different articles you can read on any given page of the newspaper, but basically everybody has that same experience. Digital information delivery means that products can be personalized enormously based on expressed preferences by individuals, as well as by inferring their interests, their needs, their wants from such data as what they're reading, where they are if they're using a mobile device with GPS, what they're shopping for, what they've bought. So Amazon, of course, has made a great capital of personalizing book offerings. So if you click on a book about Mitt Romney, you're going to start getting other interesting books about Mitt Romney, and books that other people who bought the Mitt Romney book bought. They'll say maybe you're one of those guys. As publishers and advertisers track people's movements on the web and on their mobile phones and their laptops, they begin to develop a profile about that individual, and so they can send ever more personalized, more tailored content to that individual, whether it's news and information or commercial information, also known as advertising.
Edmund Lee, personalization.
Personalization, absolutely, that's a big part of the Amazon selling strategy. But taking a step farther back, I think the key to understand here is that Jeff Bezos Amazon is fundamentally a commerce company, despite the fact that he's invested a lot in media. And if you think about the Kindle and if you think about what he did to the book business, he's more about trying to make sure as many people are on his site or on his devices buying things, and he'll sell things. He sells Kindles at a loss. He's even in sort of brokered relationship with book publishers. So despite the fact that he might end up paying the publishers more for each book, he'll sell it to the consumer at a loss just so that he can get people to his site. That's an important dynamic to understand in terms of what he might do with the Washington Post. That's the other thing, is that newspapers have become more transactional, meaning the way that the New York Times has recently and the Washington Post this year, engaging in paywalls, basically getting the reader to pay for the content as opposed to having advertisers subsidize it. So the fact that newspapers are already headed in more of a transactional or commerce mode in terms of how it'll survive or grow as a business, and the fact that Jeff Bezos has more or less engaged in that very kind of business practice at Amazon, that's one of the few sort of obvious links that I think we could probably look at in terms of why that might have appealed to him, where he might have thought that it fit into his business acumen, and probably what more to come. Another aspect to that that Alan talked about earlier as well is, if you take a look at Kindles, there are probably a few million Kindles circulating out there in the U.S. Interestingly enough, Amazon won't disclose exactly how many Kindles that they've sold, but it estimates anywhere from 2 to 4 million. That's already, 4 times the circulation of the Washington Post. You can imagine that, supposing that there's an arm's length deal, that you could see Washington Post circulation bump up just by appearing on Kindles everywhere, but also taking advantage of sort of the emergence of like e-singles or short books, so to speak, where you have sort of longer form journalism or articles that get sold as like $1 per or $2 per. And the Washington Post is a really talented staff who could, a lot of them who could easily pump out a bunch of these types of e-singles or e-books that you could buy on Kindles or Amazon or any other reading device for that matter. So there are some clear immediate overlaps that Bezos could start to sort of turn the Post in that direction. And I think whether it's personalization or single Kindles or just sort of more digital distribution for the Post, those seem to be obvious areas where he might take it.
Edmund Lee, how did the Post get into the position in the last 6-7 years where its circulation went from 700,000 to 470,000 on Sundays, 950,000 to 680,000? And got into the position where it was money losing and available for sale?
Well, so there are two main things. The internet clearly, but what the internet did was it made content largely free. So people just started going online to read about news, whether it's their local weather or sports or what's going on in the world. And second, advertisers flock to the internet as well, because that's where the readers are. That's where the ad dollars are going, because also they could buy advertising online much more cheaply than they could in newsprint. So with both of those dynamics happening, newspapers lost readers, which lowered circulation, which lowered ad dollars, on top of which advertising already moving off of print and going to the internet. So it's not just the Washington Post. It's happened across all newspapers. I think the entire newspaper sector saw about a 6% drop in advertising sales over the last few years, or year to year, that is. And it's been getting worse since 2007, 2008, when the recession hit. So, some of the blame is on the Post itself in terms of how it may have managed itself, but the bigger picture is that newspapers have been falling everywhere. And so, again, that hastened the need for, whether it was the Post or the New York Times or small market newspapers, to go online and to exploit those audiences in a smarter way without giving their content away for free, but then not turning them away entirely either. It's a balancing game in terms of what they've had to do.
If I could hop in with a bit of perspective, newspaper revenues, advertising revenues, which is their primary source of revenue for the business, peaked at over $49 billion in 2005, and last year they were around $22 billion. So more than half of the industry's primary revenue stream has been lost, and circulation is down about 40% from that 2005 to last year, and newspapers have not had a positive advertising number since the spring of 2006. And most publishers have cut back on their staffs, have reduced pages. Some publishers, such as those in New Orleans, have reduced the number of days of week that they print a newspaper, and a couple of newspapers have even gone out of business. So what has been going on is there's been an enormous contraction in the industry in terms of revenues and profits, and therefore in terms of employment. 1 out of 3 journalists have lost their jobs at American newspapers within the decade. So what happened at the Post company is that the family, having great pride of ownership in the paper, to a large degree has resisted a lot of the kind of cutbacks that other publishers have made. And what that meant is that they could have made the Post profitable in an hour, but they would have done damage to the product and to the journalism and the family legacy. So I think they decided that they don't have enough money to stay the course to find a new model. And so the Grahams decided that they would find a worthy successor who might have the vision and the resources, quite frankly, and the ambition to find a new way for doing what newspapers have done in the past and do it as well or better into the future.
Now, Mr. Mutter, what about...
The Graham family also...
go ahead, Mr. Lee.
Just to tag on there a little bit, I mean, to Alan's point, the Graham family was also very late in terms of adopting a paywall product, which most of the major metro market and even the smaller newspapers have already started doing. The fact that they could have started that years ago, the way the Times or the Financial Times or the Wall Street Journal, for example, had done years ago. And I think maybe that certainly hastened their financial difficulties, that they were so late to doing a paywall. And there's Politico, which is a blog in DC. They have a paywall product as well. It's a high-priced, high-tiered subscription product called Politico Pro, which seems to be doing fairly well. So it wasn't as if there wasn't a market for it. I think they were trying to balance the issues of being a community newspaper as well as sort of an inside the beltway read, and I think that's where they might have taken a misstep.
I don't want to go down into a big debate on the paywall, but I would say that there's a strong argument to be made against paywalls, because what they do is they harvest more money from the audience you have, which is, of course, nothing wrong with that. But they also, that wall also keeps people out who might otherwise look at your product and develop an affinity for it and visit with you more often. So some publishers have adopted paywalls, but some have not. And I think for a long time the Post Company made a strategic decision. They weren't late. It's not as though they didn't know about it, but they made a strategic decision that they wanted to build audience by offering their content without limitation in hopes of building the business. History shows that they haven't been wildly successful in that, but neither have most of the publishers who do charge for content. The Gannett Company has 1% digital-only subscription, according to some numbers I ran the other day. 1% of all of their print subscribers, a number equal to 1% of all their print subscribers subscribes to their digital-only products. That's not really a very big number in the scheme of things for these multi-billion-dollar companies.
Well, gentlemen,
but couldn't you argue that the Washington Post is already a well-respected, well-known brand, And in terms of balancing keeping readers without turning them away, a metered paywall, which is something what the New York Times does, where you could read 10 free articles in a given month, seems to be a clever way of doing it. I don't think that the Post suffered from lack of awareness amongst its readers. I think it just was, and they eventually did adopt a paywall. Yeah, the jury's still out, but if you look at the New York Times, if the New York Times is a touchstone for this debate, they now develop more than 50% of the revenues from circulation, given the fact that advertising is following. So it hasn't made up for it entirely, but it's been a big part of their business now.
I certainly agree with respect to the New York Times, but the newspaper in Visalia, California is not the New York Times. It does not have a global audience. Netflix has something on the order of 29 or 30 million people who are willing to pay for streaming content, movies and so forth. The New York Times has 700,000 people. That's when you consider that they have the whole globe to market to, that's wonderful, and I'm glad that they're doing it and they can support the work of the New York Times, but it's not a major revenue stream that comes close to equaling what's been lost with respect to print advertising.
Well, gentlemen, if we could, what about paywalls, the Wall Street Journal, and Edmund Lee, you mentioned Politico as well. Those are two newspapers that are hiring and appear to be profitable, correct? And the Orange County Register is another one that's hiring and appears to be profitable as well. What's their secret to success?
Well, I think you brought up some good examples, but they all have different reasons for their supposed success. I think the Wall Street Journal, to start with, they had a paywall from the very beginning, since the beginning of the commercial internet. I think 1996, when they went online as WSJ.com, they were probably the first news outlet to say, no, we're not giving away our content for free, you have to pay for it. And everyone said they were crazy at the time. It's like, the mantra of the internet at the time was information needs to be free, and here's Dow Jones and Co. flying in the face of that. Now it's the smart. In hindsight, it was clearly the smart play, or at least the play that everyone else is making. And so they haven't lost as much from the internet because of the fact that from the very beginning they charge people. When you look at Politico, it's an upstart. It's a new blog, a relatively new blog, and they have a tiered model, which is there is a free version which gets a lot of traffic, or at least a lot of traffic relative to its size and given its audience. But then they also started what they call Politico Pro, which is a higher end subscription model where there's a bit more of the information about the Beltway and the lobbying and the bills that are going through, sort of a higher, sort of a deeper dive for more cost. So, by all accounts, that seems to be doing well. It seems to be getting traction. So there is that two-tiered element there. The OC Register is another animal altogether. It's a community newspaper. And to Alan's earlier point, I think community newspapers may have a harder time convincing readers to pay. And I think their sort of mode in terms of doing a paywall is still really new, and the jury's still out in terms of whether it is a success for them or not, though they certainly are investing money for staff, and that you have to applaud them for that much at least.
Mr. Mutter?
Well, the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, the Financial Times, certain other products that are what we would call B2B products. They're really sold to professionals, academics, business people. They've always done very well in terms of attracting advertising and subscription rates. So it's not surprising that, for example, the Wall Street Journal has done very well. But again, most community newspapers certainly have a passionate following, but they may not be able to generate the numbers that the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times can do. And I should say that the Washington Post is certainly the brand and its location as the house organ of the capital of the free world. The Post certainly has standing in the world to attract subscription following. So in fact, they might do very well with a pay model online, but there may be other ways to go. And if you now under Mr. Bezos, since he's willing to wait a long time to make money and invest a lot in building audience, he may say the paywall isn't where I want to go right now. On the other hand, he might. I don't know. He hasn't asked me.
Well, Mr. Mutter, if you were advising him, I want to go to the $250 million figure. When you look at the fact that in the last 10 years, the Tribune Company was sold for $13 billion plus, Dow Jones, Wall Street Journal went for $5.5 billion. The Huffington Post just a couple years ago, $315 million. The Omaha World Herald sold for $200 million to Warren Buffett a few years back. Washington Post, $250 million?
Well, actually, $250 million is a pretty good price for the fact that the Washington Post is losing money. The Omaha paper wasn't losing money, and the reason that you can't even equate Huffington Post with a newspaper, because Huffington Post is viewed as being a large and growing digital enterprise. It was valued at something like 10 times its revenues on the very same day that the New York Times company was valued at about 1.5 or 2 times its revenues. So the prices associated with newspapers nowadays are all over the map. They have to do with the passion of somebody to want to own it. They have to do with market fundamentals. They have to do with the characteristics of the business itself. So the Boston Globe, which is making a profit, sold for only $70 million, and the New York Times company has to hold on to $100 million worth of, has to pay $100 million or more of pension obligations, so they actually lost money on that deal. And that was a paper that was bought for $1.1 billion in 1993 when we were living in a different world.
Edmund Lee, do you have to
if I could jump in here.
Please.
Yeah. If I could jump in on the $250 million figure, I agree with Alan. It's actually a princely sum. If you look at, and we were able to get some good sources to tell us about this, the Washington Post finances, yes, they've been losing money every year, but also if you look at a line item in their balance sheet, which looks at what they call earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, amortization, EBITDA, it's a complicated financial term. All it really means, it's a good line item to look at in terms of how much money the Post had been making. It had been making about $14.5 million in that kind of profit line. So typically, newspapers have been selling for about 3 or 4 times those profits, whereas Bezos paying $250 million was 17 times those profits. So it was a much, much higher premium than major metro market newspapers have been selling for. So in a way, the Graham family made out very nice, and its shareholders certainly as well. That's you could call that the Bezos multiple. And he sort of set, I guess you could say, a new standard for what you might pay for a premium newspaper like that.
So, Edmund Lee, do you have to be a Michael Bloomberg, a Jeff Bezos anymore to own a newspaper or publishing industry?
You mean in terms of whether you need someone to sort of fund a potentially money-losing enterprise,
yes,
or an enterprise that's not doing well? Yeah, I mean, they've tried, look at Warren Buffett. He's been buying community newspapers. It's the other end of the spectrum in newspapers, and now Jeff Bezos. I don't represent Bloomberg LP or Mike Bloomberg in any way in this capacity. There have been reports certainly that he's been interested in buying a big newspaper such as the New York Times. I think in general these days with newspapers, they tend to attract people with deep pockets just because it requires a lot of money to keep them going or to keep them funding into the future.
The reality is that the future business model for a newspaper company is somewhat uncertain, with, again, advertising revenues continuing to decline for now some 7 years, with profitability uncertain, with future consumer habits unknown in the world, in the digital world. We don't know what the next product will be to disrupt the way people get and give information. 6-7 years ago, if we'd have talked about the iPhone, we wouldn't have known what that was. Laptops are only about 3 years old. So if you're going to buy a newspaper, you aren't not buying it per se for the characteristics of the business, the dollars and cents coming in. You're buying it for a sense of civic responsibility, in the best case, or in the worst case, to help your friends and punish your enemies. And so these now tend to be things that people who have made money elsewhere and who have a little money to spend on a civic mission. More and more newspapers are being bought that way, as opposed to being bought as they used to be bought by large companies and publicly held companies like McClatchy, Gannett, in the day, the New York Times company, and so forth. So there is a real change in who owns newspapers, and according to the interests of those owners. Some communities are worried about, for example, with the owner of the Red Sox buying the Boston Globe, how will that change coverage of the Red Sox? I'm not saying it will. I'm just saying it's the question.
Mr. Mutter, why is it significant that the New York Times publisher felt a need to announce that the New York Times is not for sale?
You know, I really have been wondering about that all night long. I barely slept after I read the announcement. I kind of take it at face value because I think there's been so much speculation based on nothing other than the sale of the Post to make people wonder about whether the family could stay the course. I tend to believe that the New York Times is not for sale because the company has worked to get rid of all the other assets. It had a bunch of small regional newspapers in Florida and even one in California. It used to have own About.com. It's now gotten rid of the Boston Globe. The whole company now is centered on publishing the New York Times and all of the things it can be, such as the International Herald Tribune. So I tend to believe that the Times is not for sale, but I think that the speculation that it could be or should be is kind of logical in light of what we've seen the last few weeks. So I guess he thought that the statement would silence the speculation, but you know, being an old-time journalist, you know, that actually could be a way to we could riff off that and turn that into a whole bunch of new speculation.
And finally, gentlemen, for a last question, does this portend anything for the future of journalism and the news industry in general? Edmund Lee?
Well, it's hard to say. I think with newspapers in particular, journalism in general, journalism itself is changing. It's manifesting itself in very different ways these days, whether it's a blog or through Twitter, even for that matter, and sort of the intersection between video and newspapers these days. So it's really hard to say where it's headed. I think we're at a stage where it's still being figured out. And you know, with Jeff Bezos buying the Post, I think that's like one stark example of here's one possible future for newspapers. And I think it's everyone's doing their own version of it in terms of how they feel like they'll be able to grow their business for the future. I think one more note with Mr. Bezos in particular is that he's famous for, and this is with his business, with his Amazon business, he's famous for not caring about near-term profits. He's willing to take a loss even or live off of small margins for the long term, and that's exactly what newspapers need. That's exactly what the Washington Post needs and any other major newspaper out there. So if there's a future for newspapers or for that kind of journalism, it's going to require that kind of attitude, that kind of foresight.
Alan Mutter.
Journalism is in a state of complete disruption. Historically, most of the news and information we got was provided by large for-profit corporations, save for public broadcasting and C-SPAN, but it mostly came from large, highly profitable companies, and they were able to support having certain numbers of journalists out on the street. As those companies have shrunk, the number of journalists have gone away. The Chicago Sun-Times fired every last one of its photographers, including a Pulitzer Prize winner, because they just couldn't afford to keep them anymore. So we are now at a point where many of the old owners of newspapers are leaving, and new people are coming in, from Warren Buffett to Mr. Bezos to John Henry to the guy who owns the Orange County Register. This new blood in the industry these are all successful business people, and they're going to go back and they're going to revisit the business model and the journalism that they can afford to produce or not afford to produce remains to be seen. So at the end of the day, we're going to have to start asking ourselves. We used to know who owned the news. It used to be big publishing and broadcasting companies. Now we don't know who's going to own the news, and until we know who owns the news, we really won't know what kind of journalism we're going to get.
Alan Mutter and Edmund Lee, thank you both for being on The Communicators.
Sure.